Okay, so welcome to today's talk. If you're out there or if you're watching this later, as I said on the thing, I'm going to be talking about our visit to the Telegraph Museum and what this has to do with iPhone video. And it might seem like not a lot, but I'm going to make it hang together anyway. At any rate, a couple of weeks ago, Lisa and I were in England, and we were in Cornwall, which is the furthest western extension of the southern part of England. And if you watch Poldark, that's where it all takes place. And we had a choice between going to a tin mine, which is the thing Poldark finds most interesting, or driving down the road towards a place called Land's End, which is the end of the world, at least as far as the British Empire was concerned. We passed a little sign that said Telegraph Museum. Now, it's not every day that you get to go to the Telegraph Museum. In fact, it's hardly any day that you want to go to the Telegraph Museum. But we thought, what the hell, there's nothing out here but sand and rocks anyway, and I'm not particularly interested in going down into a tin mine, a little claustrophobic. So I said, let's go to the Telegraph Museum. So we drove to the Telegraph Museum, which was in what's it called, Lisa? Porthcurno, which I'm sure you've never heard of, and I had never heard of, and that's just before you get to the end of the world. And when you get to Porthcurno, there's about 4 houses and a lot of beach and a lot of scrub and a lot of rocks and mostly the Atlantic Ocean, and the next stop after that is the United States. And then a museum called the Telegraph Museum, which we went into. There were not long lines. This was not like tourists going to see the Tower of London. In fact, we were not the only people there, but we were almost the only people there. The other people were, well, not to be pejorative, but the kind of people you would expect to go to the Telegraph Museum. So we went into the Telegraph Museum and we got the lecture from the lady who ran the Telegraph Museum, and actually it turned out to be quite interesting. The telegraph, not to give you too much history, but as you probably know, the telegraph was invented in 1844, and Samuel Morse developed Morse code, dot, 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 as a way of communicating in telegraphs. And for the most part, telegraphs were limited to where you could string the wires, because it's stringing the wires. The first telegraph went from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and the first telegraph message was, "What hath God wrought?" And apparently God had wrought a new way of communicating. And as long as you could string the wires outside, and most telegraph wires ran along railroad tracks because they were used by the railways, and it was fairly easy to do. Transatlantic communication by telegraph was something nobody even thought of, because how could you run the wires across the Atlantic Ocean? But in Britain, they decided they wanted to take a crack at it. And so they began to lay telegraphic wire across the Atlantic Ocean. This meant essentially creating a telegraphic wire and dropping it down the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean all the way from North America to Britain. You can imagine what kind of an engineering feat this was in 1866, which is when they tried the first one, not to mention the expense of the thing. At any rate, in 1866, they actually laid the first telegraph wire that went all the way from North America to England. And of course, they didn't want to schlep the thing all the way to London, so they landed it at the very first place they could get on the coast of Britain, the closest they could get to North America, which was in fact this Porthcurno in western extremes of Britain. And that's where the first telegraph cable came in, which I guess is why the museum was there. The thing lasted for about 10 minutes, and they got one message across, which I actually wrote down here. And it was, "Glory to God." Well, that was Victorian England, and that was the kind of crap they were into in those days. And then the telegraph wire broke, which was not a surprise, considering they had 3,000 miles of, nobody had any, there was the rubber didn't even exist, they didn't have the technology for it. So the thing gave out after about 10 minutes, and then they decided, we're going to do another one. And this time, and they have all the cables there. This first one's like this. They got thicker and thicker and thicker and more insulation, but they kept breaking down and breaking apart because they didn't really know what they were doing. And finally, in 1866, they got the last one to go across. It took them 19 years. The first one was in 1858. In 1866, they got the last one. And this was done by a British industrialist. He was sort of the Elon Musk of Great Britain. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and he built this giant ship called the Great Eastern. You can imagine how much cable was coiled up in this thing to drop it all the way across the Atlantic and make it work. And the connection actually held. So for the first time, Britain was connected to North America by a telegraph cable. Now, it was, you think making transatlantic calls was expensive in the 1970s. Sending a one cable message took like 19 minutes, and it was incredibly expensive. The first cable message that went across the Atlantic was from President Buchanan to Queen Victoria. I think it was like, how are you doing? And she went, great, and you. But it was an amazing piece of transformative technology, because up until the cable had been laid and actually worked, the quickest way you could get a message from North America to Europe was by putting an envelope in a letter on board a ship. And that, believe me, took a long time, and there was no guarantee it was going to get there. So for the 19th century, this is a transformative piece of technology. Now, how come the museum was there? The museum was there because once the British figured out how to lay cable that actually worked, telegraph cable that actually worked, they began dropping it all over the world like crazy, because they had, in those days, the British Empire, which occupied 1/4 of the surface of the world, and they ran 1/4 of the world's population. That's a bit hard to believe now, but that's how the world was during Queen Victoria's time. So these guys, they ran India, and they ran Kenya, and they ran Nigeria. They ran about half of Africa. They ran Australia. They ran New Zealand. They ran Canada. They had a lot of the world to manage. And the best way to manage it, they felt, was dropping these telegraphic cables around the Atlantic. So the next one they dropped went from Port Cornwall to Cape Town, South Africa, which they also happened to run at the time. Then they ran another one that went from Cape Town, South Africa to India. Then ran another one that went from India to Australia, and Australia to New Zealand. And so finally, after about 20 or 30 years, they had the whole world wired up, all terminating in this little tiny village in western Cornwall on the beach, because that's where all the physical thing, these physical cables actually came in up on the beach, and there's the little hut there at the end that shows you where all the cables came in. And I guess if you looked at it, they would have been wired, and one was said Australia, South Africa, whatever. And this is how the empire essentially was run. Not only the empire, but investments, stock exchanges, shipping things, all the pertinent information in the world passed through the nexus of this one little tiny village in western Cornwall, which is pretty astonishing when you think about it. So for about 50 years, this was the center of the communications universe. This little tiny village, it was the cutting edge of technology. So it was kind of the Apple and Facebook and Instagram and Google all jammed together, and here it was, the center of the world. And then in 1898, an Italian inventor named Marconi arrived in England with his newest invention, which he called wireless, because the others were based on wire. And with wireless, you could transmit radio signals across the Atlantic, or in fact anywhere in the world, without the wires. Well, first of all, as you can imagine, laying all those cables, it cost a lot of money. And people bought stock, and they invested in it, and people thought it was going to be worth a lot of money for a long time. And as soon as Marconi came along, that whole investment was wiped out and worthless and nothing, and essentially ended up as it was today, which is a little tiny museum in a little tiny village that virtually nobody goes to visit. Now, an interesting sidebar was that we went into the thing, and we sat in the main, they had one of these lecture halls, which is where you go in after you pay your £6 admission to get in. And there's Lisa and me, and then a bunch of, I think they call them anoraks in England. We call them geeks in America. I mean, who else would visit the Telegraph Museum except for them and us? So this woman gave the lecture, and her father-in-law had been the last engineer who would run the thing, and it had gotten closed down in the 1950s and shuttered, and that was the end of it. And she gave the lecture, and she showed us all the cables, which was all quite interesting. And then she said, and then that terrible man Marconi came along and ruined everything. Well, of course, it was radio that ruined everything, and that's kind of the point of the story, because it's the advent of a new technology. They come along like this, and they wipe out every other technology, no matter how important it was, no matter how much money you spent on it, no matter how much, at one point, this little tiny village was the center of the universe, and no matter for how long the British wireless or wire and cable business was the Apple and the Facebook and the Google of its time, and then suddenly it was bankrupt and worthless in an afternoon because of Marconi. what this brings me to is I recently got, yesterday or today in fact, I got an email from a very nice woman who's a correspondent at Fox News, and she went off to Poland with her, to visit with her father or grandfather to go visit Auschwitz because they're concentration camp survivors. And she said that Fox gave her permission to go and make a video about the thing. And then she had pictures on Instagram, and she's schlepping this giant camera with this microphones and all this crap that is, to me, completely archaic and about on the same level as giant copper wires to send telegraphs. Because every project that we do now is basically done on phones. And to me, iPhone video is as good or better than those giant cameras. They shoot 4K, you edit them, they stream live, they put in graphics. It's an amazing piece of technology. And just like radio, when Marconi came along, or wireless, obviated the need for cables or physical wire cables to communicate with telegrams. So iPhone video is going to obviate the need for all those giant cameras and camera crews and cameramen and professional videographers and all that kind of crap that goes along with it, because this thing is an amazing piece of technology, and like Marconi's radio, it is going to wipe the other thing out. And like the Museum of Telegraph in Porthcurno, which is a lovely little village, one day we will have over here across the street at 30 Rockefeller Center, the Museum of the Today Show, which, today is the prime center of global broadcasting with giant equipment and studios and all that kind of stuff. But just like the cables, where 95% of the world's cable traffic went through this one node, and it turned into a museum piece because of a new piece of technology, that thing at 30 Rockefeller Center across the street, or over there if you're looking at that picture, is also going to become a complete museum piece. That may seem hard to believe, but technology is unforgiving. When a new piece of technology comes along, it invokes a system called creative destruction. That is, it creates new business, which obviously the iPhone and the smartphone and everything on phones has done between apps, but there's a destructive aspect to it, and the destructive aspect is it wipes out industries that were based on a technology that the new technology obviates. Well, the technology of smartphones or iPhones and the video and the screen and the apps and the live streaming and the ability to edit and the ability to edit graphics and the fact that anybody can do this and the fact that it shoots totally broadcast quality and the fact that I can talk to you like this for free, whereas 10 years ago I would have needed a satellite connection and spent more money than I care to talk to so few people. But now anybody can do this, and the fact that anybody can do it means that everybody is going to do it. So today's lesson from the museum at Porthcurno is that the old technology essentially is dead as a doornail, as dead as telegraphs are, and one day we will no doubt have the Broadcast Museum of Television, which will also be visited by 8 anoraks who are geeks who have an interest in giant cameras. It's hard to believe, but it's going to happen. So that's the lesson for today. And if you have any questions about this or anything else, I'm going to stay on Facebook. I'm going to turn off the video, but I'm going to stay on Facebook to answer your questions on any topic you might have. And thanks for tuning in.